October 12, 1943. Camp McCain, Mississippi. The line of men shuffling through the mess hall didn't look like the fearsome Wehrmacht soldiers American newspapers had warned about. Sunken cheeks. Hollow eyes. Uniforms still damp with salt water and diesel fuel. These were U-boat sailors, pulled from the cold Atlantic 3 weeks earlier after their submarine had been depth-charged into surrender. For 72 hours, they'd floated in life rafts, watching the oil slicks spread across the water where their boat had been. Then came the American destroyer, the captivity, the long voyage across an ocean they'd been trying to dominate. Now they stood in a Mississippi camp, staring at metal trays loaded with something that made absolutely no sense. Ground beef patties, browned and glistening with fat, sat on pillowy white bread. Golden French fries, still steaming. Small paper squares of real butter, not margarine, not the gray substitute they'd been eating since 1941, but actual yellow butter. And coffee. Dark, aromatic, genuine coffee that hadn't been stretched with acorns or chicory. The smell alone was almost obscene. An older Feldwebel, a sergeant with Iron Cross ribbons still pinned to his tattered uniform, stopped at the serving line. He stared at the tray being offered to him as if it contained something dead and rotting. His lip curled. "Das ist Hundefutter," he muttered to the younger sailor behind him. "That's dog food." He refused to take the tray, standing rigid until an American guard gently but firmly moved him along. The sergeant took the tray. He did not eat. This wasn't how it was supposed to go. Every one of these men had been thoroughly educated by Dr. Goebbels' propaganda machine. Americans were soft, culturally degenerate, a mongrel nation that couldn't produce real soldiers or real food. They ate garbage, lived in decadence, had no discipline. Germany was superior in every way, in spirit, in culture, in the quality of its bread and sausages. Proper German food meant dense rye bread, blood sausage, sauerkraut. Not this minced meat on cloud-like bread that had no substance, no tradition, no soul. But here was the problem. They were starving. Most of these U-boat men hadn't seen fresh beef in over a year. Submarine rations were canned mystery meat, moldy bread, and ersatz coffee that tasted like burned dirt. The Africa Corps survivors arriving at other camps, places like Concordia in Kansas, Hearne in Texas, had been living on hardtack and water, sometimes for weeks at a stretch. By late 1943, Germany was losing, though the propaganda said otherwise. Rations were severe. Families back home were weighing potato peels to make them last. And here, in an enemy prison camp, were hamburgers. The cognitive dissonance was staggering. They'd expected brutality. They'd heard whispers about Soviet camps where prisoners froze and starved. They'd been trained to expect nothing but punishment from their captors. Instead, they got the Geneva Convention, which required that prisoners of war receive the same rations as the captor nation's own troops. The same rations. 4,000 calories per day. 3 full meals. Butter. Real coffee. Over 371,000 German POWs would eventually be held in the United States during World War II. Camp McCain alone housed 3,000 prisoners. The facilities were sprawling, clean barracks, running water, medical stations. But nothing prepared them for the abundance of the food. Nothing could reconcile what they'd been told with what now sat on metal trays in front of them. The young private from Hamburg ate first. He was maybe 19, barely old enough to shave, and he'd been at sea for 6 months before the depth charges came. His hands shook as he lifted the hamburger. The first bite was cautious, suspicious. Then his eyes widened. The meat was seasoned, salt, pepper, maybe onion. It was hot. It was abundant. There was enough to actually feel full, a sensation he'd almost forgotten. He ate quickly, methodically, and didn't look at the sergeant who was still refusing to touch his tray. One by one, others followed. A panzer crewman captured in Tunisia. A radio operator. An engineer. The smell was too much. The hunger was too real. And slowly, reluctantly, even the proud ones began to eat. Within days, something shifted. The men who'd scoffed at hamburgers as dog food were now trading their cigarette rations, precious currency in any prison camp, for extra helpings. Arguments broke out over which American cook made the best patties. Some prisoners began asking about recipes, trying to understand how Americans achieved that perfect crust on the outside while keeping the inside juicy. Back in Germany, civilian rations were being cut again. In cities like Berlin and Hamburg, families were subsisting on turnips and watery soup. The official daily calorie count for German civilians had dropped below 2,000 and was still falling. Here, in Camp McCain, German prisoners were gaining weight. 15 pounds. 20. 30. Their uniforms, which had hung loose on their frames when they arrived, now strained at the buttons. George Gartner, a German POW who would later write extensively about his experience, remembered thinking they were being fattened up for some reason. It seemed impossible that captors would feed prisoners this well unless there was a trick involved. But the trick never came. The hamburgers kept coming. Sunday brought ice cream, vanilla, chocolate, strawberry. The same men who'd been taught that Americans were weak and degenerate couldn't square that propaganda with the reality of full plates and generous portions. The Feldwebel finally ate on the third day. No one saw him take that first bite. But by the end of the week, he was in line with everyone else, and the hamburger on his tray never made it back to the table uneaten. The first week was the hardest. Some prisoners still refused to eat, convinced the food was poisoned or part of some elaborate psychological operation. Why else would the enemy feed them so well? A few officers, clinging to the last shreds of military hierarchy, warned their men not to show weakness by accepting what they called inferior American slop. Pride battled empty stomachs every morning in that mess hall. Pride lost. A Wehrmacht lieutenant from Bavaria actually tried to organize a boycott. "We are German soldiers," he announced to his barracks. "We do not grovel for their charity." The boycott lasted until lunchtime, when the smell of frying onions and sizzling beef drifted through the camp. By dinner, even the lieutenant was in line, though he made a show of eating slowly, methodically, as if performing an unpleasant duty rather than enjoying himself. But the younger men had no such pretense. The 19-year-old from Hamburg started asking the camp cooks questions through broken English and hand gestures. How did they get the meat so flavorful? What was in the seasoning? The cooks, mostly farm boys from Mississippi and Tennessee, found the whole thing amusing. Here were the feared German warriors, the U-boat wolves of the Atlantic, begging for hamburger secrets like housewives at a church social. George Gartner, who'd been captured with an infantry unit in Italy, later wrote that the food was unbelievable. "We thought we were being fattened up for some reason." His memoir described the first time he saw Americans throw food away, actual edible food, tossed in garbage bins because someone didn't want their vegetables. "We couldn't comprehend the waste," he wrote. "They threw away more food than we'd seen in months." At Camp Concordia in Kansas, the camp commander Felix Sparks noted in his official reports that German POWs couldn't believe the portions and kept asking if there had been some mistake. Within a month, an entire underground economy emerged around hamburgers. The currency was cigarettes, American brands that the Red Cross provided. A private would trade 3 cigarettes for an extra hamburger patty. 5 cigarettes could get you someone else's Sunday dessert ration. 10 cigarettes and you could convince one of the cooks to make your burger special, extra cheese, extra onions, cooked just the way you liked it. Men who'd fought across North Africa and survived the brutal Eastern Front were now negotiating over ground beef like commodity traders. The weight gain was undeniable. Camp records from Concordia show that German POWs gained an average of 15 to 30 pounds during their first 6 months of captivity. Men arrived gaunt, hollow-cheeked, their ribs visible through their shirts. 6 months later, they had color in their faces, meat on their bones, and energy they hadn't felt since before the war started. The camp doctor at McCain actually had to adjust uniform sizes 3 times because prisoners kept outgrowing their clothes. But something deeper was happening beyond the physical transformation. These men were experiencing an ideological crisis with every bite. If Americans were truly degenerate, culturally inferior, Why was their food so abundant? If Germany was the superior civilization, why were its people starving while prisoners ate beef and ice cream? The questions were dangerous, the kind that could get you reported by a fellow prisoner who still believed. So they didn't ask them out loud. They just kept eating. Letters home were carefully censored, both by the Americans and by the prisoners themselves. No one wanted to tell their families, surviving on ration cards and ersatz everything, that they were eating hamburgers and drinking real coffee every single day. One letter, intercepted and preserved in the National Archives, carefully danced around the truth. The conditions here are acceptable. We are adequately fed. Adequately. The word was doing enormous work. The mess hall became a ritual. The smell of frying onions at 6 in the morning. The sound of metal spatulas scraping griddles. The sight of trays loaded with more food than seemed reasonable. Ice cream on Sundays became something men looked forward to with an enthusiasm that embarrassed them. Grown soldiers, veterans of brutal campaigns, would light up like children when the servers announced what flavors were available. Strawberry was particularly prized. A diary entry, discovered years later among the belongings of a former POW, captured the absurdity perfectly. I have become what I feared, a man who dreams of American cheeseburgers. My grandmother would disown me. Yesterday I had an argument with Schmidt about whether the cooks used paprika or just black pepper. We nearly came to blows. Over seasoning. What has happened to us? The camp commanders, amused and perhaps a bit baffled, tried to maintain some semblance of German military discipline. At one facility, officers actually issued an order banning excessive enthusiasm for hamburgers. It was ignored within 48 hours. You cannot order men to stop enjoying the best food they've had in years. The order itself became a joke, something prisoners laughed about while waiting in the lunch line. Some POWs were assigned to work details on local American farms, earning a small wage and seeing the American abundance firsthand. They watched farmers throw away produce that wasn't pretty enough for market. They saw grain silos that seemed to stretch to the horizon. They ate lunch with farming families who served portions that would have fed entire German villages. The propaganda had told them America was weak, stretched thin, barely holding together. The reality was grain elevators full to bursting and more beef than anyone knew what to do with. By late 1944, even the most stubborn holdouts had converted. The hamburger wasn't dog food. It wasn't a trick. It was just dinner. And it was very, very good. Spring 1945 brought news that should have been welcomed with celebration. Germany had surrendered. The war was over. Repatriation ships were being prepared to take prisoners home. Instead, something strange happened at camps across America. Men started dragging their feet. Some developed mysterious illnesses that required extended medical observation. Others suddenly discovered paperwork errors that needed resolution before they could be processed for departure. A few simply stated with remarkable honesty that they weren't ready to leave. Camp McCain's records show that several German POWs formally requested to remain in the United States as agricultural workers. The requests were polite, carefully worded, and absolutely sincere. One letter, preserved in the National Archives, put it plainly: I wish to apply for permission to stay and work on American farms. I have skills in agriculture and am a hard worker. The food here is good. The future here is good. The subtext was clear. Going home meant going back to ruin. They weren't wrong. Germany in 1946 was a landscape of rubble and starvation. Cities like Berlin, Hamburg, and Dresden were destroyed, reduced to mountains of brick and twisted metal. The official ration for German civilians had dropped below 1,000 calories per day in many areas, starvation level. There was no beef, no butter, no coffee except the ersatz kind made from burned grain. Just turnips, black bread when it was available, and watery soup that barely counted as food. The men who'd been defeated and held in American camps were healthier, better fed, and in some cases heavier than they'd been before the war started. The irony was crushing. POWs who'd spent 2 years in captivity were better off than the civilians who'd held the homeland. Some former prisoners became quiet advocates for democracy when they returned, not because of political speeches or ideological conversion, but because they'd learned a simple lesson: The side with full plates had been telling the truth, and the side with empty promises had been lying. Food was the first and most visceral lesson in what prosperity actually looked like. Others simply couldn't stop thinking about the hamburgers. Willie Schmidt, a composite of several real accounts, had arrived at Camp Concordia in Kansas as a U-boat radio operator in 1943, weighing 145 pounds and looking like a strong wind might knock him over. When he left in 1946, he weighed 180 pounds and had the robust constitution of a man who'd been eating 4,000 calories a day for 3 years. He returned to Hamburg, found his family's apartment building reduced to rubble, lived on turnips for 6 months, and decided he'd had enough. In 1952, he emigrated back to the United States. By 1955, he owned a small diner in Kansas. The specialty? German-American burgers, hamburgers with a secret ingredient he claimed was proper German seasoning, though everyone suspected it was just the same recipe the camp cooks had used. The Marshall Plan, launched in 1948, would operate on similar logic that the POW camps had accidentally demonstrated. Feed your former enemies. Show them abundance instead of scarcity. Win the peace through full stomachs and rebuilt economies. It was hamburger diplomacy on a continental scale, soft power delivered through calories and kindness. The cost of feeding German POWs well during the war had been minimal compared to the goodwill it generated and the ideological battles it won. The cultural impact rippled outward in unexpected ways. German-American fusion cuisine began appearing in restaurants across the Midwest, created by former POWs who'd stayed or returned as immigrants. The hamburger itself, ironically descended from the Hamburg steak that German immigrants had brought to America in the 19th century, completed its journey as the ultimate symbol of American abundance and cultural confidence. What had been German became quintessentially American, then returned to Germany transformed. October 12, 1943. That mess hall in Camp McCain. The Feldwebel who'd refused his tray and called it dog food. By December, he was leading the line. By spring 1944, he was asking the cooks to write down their recipes. When his belongings were catalogued before repatriation in 1946, a grease-stained index card was found among his letters and photographs. Written in careful, German-accented English. Das Amerikanische Hamburger, nicht Hundefutter. Tatsächlich ziemlich gut. The American hamburger, not dog food. Actually quite good. Wars are won with tanks and aircraft carriers, with soldiers and strategy and industrial might. But beliefs are changed with simpler things. With hamburgers served hot and plentiful. With coffee that's actually coffee. With the kindness of treating even your enemies like human beings worthy of a decent meal. Propaganda dies when confronted with full plates and the undeniable evidence of your own senses. You can tell a man that his enemy is weak and degenerate, but it's hard to maintain that belief when the weak and degenerate are feeding you better than your own country ever did. Of the 371,000 German POWs held in the United States during World War II, over 5,000 chose to stay permanently after the war ended. Post-war surveys found that 80% of former German POWs rated their treatment as fair or better than expected. The hamburger survival rate was 100%. Every single man who passed through those camps remembered them, and many never forgot that moment when expectation collided with reality and reality won. Sometimes the most important battles aren't fought with weapons. Sometimes they're fought with ground beef on white bread, served with a side of fries and the radical notion that even your enemies deserve to eat well. If this story showed you how something as simple as a hamburger could break through years of propaganda and change hearts, hit that like button. Subscribe if you want more untold stories from history that reveal the human truth behind the headlines. And comment below, what's the meal that changed your perspective on something? Let's talk about it.